A technology investor by the name of Robert F. Smith made an announcement on Sunday, May 19th. It was just a few weeks ago. And this announcement made headlines around the world and changed the lives of dozens of graduating college students. He was the commencement speaker at Morehouse College in Atlanta. And this is an all-boys university, the one where Martin Luther King actually received his degree. And near the end of his address to the grads, he announced that he was going to wipe out the entire student debt of the 2019 graduating class. Now, that was going to be around $40 million. So as you can imagine, the place went wild, right? The students erupted in applause. They were in disbelief. Even the staff and the parents were clapping. They were elated. And you just have to Google this event and you can see how much coverage this has received. Now, extreme generosity like that, it really just makes a person smile, doesn't it? It stirs something good and right within us. It moves us. It motivates us. And do you ever wonder why something like that has this kind of effect on people? I think it's because most of us are inclined to live for ourselves and for our own needs before we think of others. And so when we see someone do something so incredibly different, it moves us. It stands out. There are really two kinds of people in the world. And let me clarify here, it's not rich and poor. Wealth has nothing to do with this. There are two kinds of people. There are givers and there are takers. Now, parents, you get it when I say you are constant givers, right? It might be feeding time for the baby, or it's diaper changing time once again. And when they get older, it's constantly driving your kids somewhere. Or when they're teens, it's navigating all the things that you need to navigate for their life. When they're young adults, you want them gone, but they're still at home, and you're giving and giving, and they're taking and taking. You get what I mean, right? You know, it's interesting because takers are those who, after even just hearing a story like I started with, sit back and go, well, no one ever offered to wipe out my student debt. No one ever did something that cool for me. Givers and takers, those who feel blessed and those who feel entitled. And anyone who has an entitlement mentality is a taker. It's kind of like, it's my right. It's rightfully mine. It's about me and no one else. So it's like this. If it's in my hand, it's mine. If I had it first, it's mine. If I saw it first, it's mine. If I want it, it's mine. If you put it down, it's mine. If I put it down, it's still mine. If it's broken, it's yours. Takers. Now, as you know, I'm starting a new series today entitled For Edmonton. And it's a series that helps us understand and live with intentionality when it comes to reaching our city. We want to be a church that is for Edmonton. We want to be people who live our lives in such a way. And we all know this, that Christians many times can be known for the things that we are against, but we want people to know what we are for. And that means this: God is for people. He wants people to know him. He loves them. He desires relationship with them through Jesus and through the sacrifice Jesus paid for every single one of us on the cross. A great premise for this is what Paul, he's a New Testament author, and he actually wrote this to a group of Christians. He said this: be wise in the way you act toward outsiders. Now, outsiders meaning anyone who isn't part of the family of God, part of the faith. Make the most of every opportunity. Let your conversation be always full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone. I really love those verses. And when examining the life of Jesus, we discover that he was consistently for people. For those others wrote off, for those that were forgotten, for those that seemed to have it all together, for those that wanted a different life. Jesus was for them. And since we believe around here that following Jesus is the best decision anyone can make, we want to model our lives after him and therefore be for people as well. Now, Jesus' whole life was marked by giving and not getting. I mean, he ultimately gave his life so all of us could live, and that's the greatest gift he could have given. But there's hardly a facet of his life that doesn't illustrate some aspect of generosity. He demonstrated the blessing of what it meant to live in a generous way. And he said these words, and his life backed it up. He said this: "It is more blessed to give than to receive." Now, I know when I say words like giving and generosity in a church setting, some of you automatically think, okay, it's going to be the money talk again. It's about giving. Okay, sure, finances are important in generosity. And the reality is that our church operates and can only do things on the commitment of giving from amazing people like you. So let me, from my heart to yours, say thank you for stepping up and giving. But I'm talking today about a lifestyle of generosity that is way bigger than just our finances. In the Old Testament, we are introduced to a man by the name of Solomon, who was, by the way, the richest man alive in his day. He was the wealthiest person in the world. And so he would compete with guys like Warren Buffett and Jeff Bezos today. And there was a time when he wrote about how he tried to use his resources, his wealth, and really the options he had to fill this void that was inside of him. And he discovered that it really didn't amount to much, nothing more than temporary happiness. In fact, the exact wording that he uses is this pursuit was all meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Now, takers are fueled by appetites. And appetites are the things that make every single one of us want more. They are really what make us discontent with what we have. And they convince us that what is next is going to satisfy. Now, if I were to ask you if that was true, I'm pretty sure we'd all agree and say we know that whatever we want next isn't the answer, but our appetites deceive us into believing something we know isn't true. And in a way, it's just this vicious cycle because many times we end up buying into it. Now, in his teachings, Jesus identified 4 attitudes in people. He illustrated 2 kinds of givers and 2 kinds of takers. And he did this through using the language of animals. Takers he called wolves and goats, and givers he called sheep and lambs. And if you were to look through his teaching, it's amazing how much he uses this kind of language to make a point. Here's a sample. He said this: "Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves." Wolves ultimately are people. They're takers consumed with greed. In fact, Jesus went further and identified the wolves of his day as the religious leaders. He said this: "You Pharisees, you clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside you are full of greed and wickedness." Greed is this insatiable longing for wealth, power, and status. 3 things that we all love and essentially think will fill the void in our lives. And I don't know about you guys, but when you look at status, it's kind of an interesting thing these days, isn't it? Like some of us are fueled by how many likes our Instagram post got, or how many views our video got. Greed has a great way of disguising itself to look normal and even necessary. It's wanting to possess more than we need, and at its root lies pride and discontentment. Greed fuels dissatisfaction with the blessings that God has currently given us. And it always causes us to care less about others and more about ourselves, just like the religious leaders in Jesus' day. So they did stuff like they would pray in public so that everyone would see them. They would make sure that they kept the laws of the Sabbath to the T so that everyone could observe. They would give in front of all people so they would know their good deeds. It was always about them first and about them advancing and looking good. And our culture makes excessive greed, even excessive consumption, normal. And so that's why there's a news headline. That's why we're stopped in our tracks when someone says they're going to pay the debt of an entire graduating class. Because that acts outside of greed, and something like that arrests our attention. Now, it's important to realize I'm not speaking against wealth here. I'm talking about greed. They are different. Wealth is an amazing blessing in the right hands. What it really comes down to is this here, friends. It's not that we have stuff. It's an issue when stuff has us. Wolves live to get. They don't live to give. And because of our sinful nature, greed is our innate, our really normal inclination. And since that is the case, we have to consciously choose a different pattern and a different approach. We need to work at not having this be forefront in our lives. Peter was a disciple of Christ, and he understood this tension when he wrote the following words. He said this, "To this you were called because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps." So what he's saying is that we are called to follow Jesus' example. Now think about this. We're only called to something because we aren't already doing it naturally. And when we're called to something, it's probably because we were going to do something else first. And so Christ called us to live different lives than the world around us. And that means the pursuit of greed needs to take a back seat for us. Now, Jesus also identified another kind of taker. He called them goats. And goats aren't necessarily out to take from others, but they are completely self-centered people. They're not greedy, but they would be characterized as selfish. At the core, people like this lack consideration for others. It's a preoccupation with themselves and with their own affairs. It's kind of why, I read this past week, it's why we can have people at a park record some teenage boys beating up a mom and just holding up a video camera instead of helping out. It's why we have people who don't want to get involved with an altercation on the subway and would rather pull out their phone and post. It's a preoccupation with ourselves. And something like this kind of happened to me just the other day. I was driving down the road and I was getting ready to turn into a parking lot, turn right. And there was a row of cars that I was behind, just waiting my turn to turn right. And there was this set of lights and there was also cars on the opposite side wanting to turn left into the same parking lot. Well, the laws of traffic. If you're turning left, you got to wait for all those to turn right first. And let's just say there was a very nice gentleman in a truck who, when it was my turn to turn right, decided to gun it and just booked out in front of me, to which I had to slam on the brakes before I hit him. And you know what I said? I stopped and I looked at him and I said, "You go, man," right? No, I didn't say that. But, that it's an experience there. And if you're that dude in the truck today, I'm so glad you're in church. That's awesome. But Jesus taught that a time was coming when all humanity would be separated into two groups. He called them sheep and goats. And he really painted the difference here between givers and takers. Goats were those only focused on their own desires, needs, and their interests, and sheep were generous with their time, their resources, and love. And I want to read you what Jesus said here, and it's found in Matthew chapter 25. "When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, he will sit on his throne in heavenly glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats." There's the language. "He will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, 'Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. I needed clothes and you clothed me. I was sick and you looked after me. I was in prison and you came to visit me.' Then the righteous will answer him, 'Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison or go and visit you?' And the king will reply," it's kind of interesting, right? Like they don't even know they're doing this. And they're like, when did this happen? The king will reply, 'I tell you the truth, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me.' Then he will say to those on his left, 'Depart from me, you who are cursed, into eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger and you did not invite me in. I needed clothes and you did not clothe me. I was sick and in prison and you did not look after me.' And again, these people ask the same question. Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or needing clothes or sick or in prison and did not help you? He will reply, I tell you the truth, whatever you did not do for one of the least of these, you did not do for me. Now, I got to be honest with you. That passage there has always kind of messed with me. Because Jesus says that we're going to be evaluated in the future based on how we treat people in the here and now. So people who know Jesus are marked by giving. So what are some signs that maybe you're leaning a little bit too much into the taker category? I want to give you a few here. Maybe you can filter this in your own head here this morning. You're constantly asking people for favors. You believe that you should receive special treatment. Your viewpoint and ways are always right over others. You feel entitled. And to top it off, you're one of those people who never cleans up your dog's mess outside. You know what I'm saying? Takers. Jesus expects those of us who want to follow him to live unselfish lives and to bless others around us. And sheep are those who live generous lives. They are people who bring encouragement and affirmation to others. They give of their time, their skills, their resources. They are a reflection of Christ to the world. And choosing to embrace life in this way, it's not really this one-time deal, a one-off. It's a calling. It's actually an expectation. It's the posturing of our whole life and heart. It's a mindset that governs the way we approach the world. I mean, Paul wrote it this way: in your relationships with one another. So in other words, in the people or with the people that you hang out with, in the relationships that are around you daily, in your city where you do life, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Sheep live with an abundance and not a scarcity mindset. They believe that God is the source of all they have, and they live to bless and serve those around them. And truthfully, and I mean this from the bottom of my heart, I could brag on a lot of people from this church who exemplify these traits. People who step up and get this and live this out. And you know who you are, and I'll say this, if that's you, know that God honors and blesses this in your life. But I do want to make specific mention today of one family, and I've known them probably for over a decade now, and they're on a journey that has dramatically changed them. Last summer at camp, our church camp, Melissa felt moved and called by God to go and do something with missions. Something was stirred inside of her, and the driver was this: there are people in the world who have never heard or never had the chance to hear or accept Jesus, and that disturbed her. And she didn't mention anything to her husband, Eric, but the brilliancy of all of this was God was working on his heart through another couple in our church who decided to take a year and work in Guatemala, and that couple's known as the Ladreses. And a long story short, Melissa and Eric came together and said, we both feel God calling us to go and do something, to get out of our comfort zone, to be used by him. And the process for them has moved quickly, and now they're preparing for this fall to move to the South Sudan. And just like that, they're in the process of taking a next step and saying, we want to be givers. We want to live generously. And I didn't mention this, but here's the deal. This couple also has 3 kids, ages 8, 5, and 2. Givers are stirred by something bigger than just themselves. And living this way is truly countercultural, and it's even counterintuitive. And so Jesus in his teaching, he talks about wolves, goats, sheep, and lambs. And there's a progression here. It's like wolves are greedy, goats are self-centered, sheep are stewards of what God has entrusted to them, and lambs are those people who live fully generous lives. It's when generosity goes beyond stewardship. This is next level, and sometimes I would say pretty difficult to embrace. It's when generosity is evaluated by the amount of cheerfulness behind it. Paul also wrote these words. Remember this: And by the way, if you ever read something in the Bible that starts with those two words, like remember this, it's kind of like, okay, this, what I'm going to write right now is really important. This is something that should stick in your knower. This is something that you should remember in your Christian life. Remember this. Whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly. And whoever sows generously will also reap generously. Each of you should give what you have decided in your heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion. For God loves a what? A cheerful giver. You see, lambs are people who love to be generous. They find joy in it. They find exuberance in it. It kind of jacks them up. And in order to become generous, guess what you got to do? You got to give. Generosity only grows through the actions and the practice of sharing and giving. You know, there's this time in Jesus' life where he said to his disciples, I send you out as lambs among wolves. And you can almost feel the tension there, right? It's implied that these guys are going to feel vulnerable. But that's the point. Sometimes our generosity can make us feel vulnerable. It's like we can say, okay, God, you need to pull through here because I'm going to take this step of faith. I'm going to trust you with this, but I need you to do something here. And lambs know that they are empowered by God and by his miraculous provision. So the disciples, they were sent out. They were told to carry nothing, no money, no bag, no backpack, no clothes, nothing. And yet they had incredible success. And we read that they came back to Jesus overjoyed. They discovered that living in deep dependency and irrational generosity is something God richly rewards. There's something deeply satisfying when we understand this generosity tension. It challenges the presuppositions driving our culture. I mean, we think the highest joy comes by living the way wolves and goats would live, but ironically, the highest joy and fulfillment comes to sheep and lambs. In this series, it's a challenge for us to become the people Jesus intended and talked about. Because when you're for something, you know what it means? It means that you're all in. Imagine if we at Hope City were known for being all in with generosity. We were known for being givers. And truthfully, I got to say this, we have a little bit of history here at our church in regards to this. I mean, back in 2013, we funded a province-wide Alpha initiative across denominations. Our church did that. We built a learning center in India. We built churches in Africa. We built a training center in Guatemala. People here stepped up and helped us fund the launch of our Terwilliger campus last September. Friends, let's keep on being that church. Imagine if Edmonton knew that people at Hope City existed to serve and bless them. And we all know that no reform happens without a vision. And no vision happens unless people believe it can happen. And our church's vision is to have 1% of Edmonton call our church home. But that can only be a reality if we all believe that every single one of us are called to impact our city, our neighborhoods, our workplaces, that we're all called to make a difference, that we're all called to be stewards of what God has given us and to be generous with what we have. Now, I don't know about you guys. Maybe you feel this, but my life a lot of times ends up being about me almost by default. It's this tension I walk. And if you find yourself, maybe you're leaning more in the taker category than you want to, let me encourage you. There's no way that you can jump from here to extreme generosity in just one day. But there's a next step that you can do. There's a next step, no matter where we find ourselves on that spectrum, that every single one of us can do. One that unlocks God's grace in a greater way in our life and in the world around us. And I think that step simply begins by engaging this question. What is one act of generosity that will stretch you this week? What is one act of generosity that will stretch you this week? You see, we change a city, a province, and a nation through generosity. We change people by being givers. We change lives by making generosity a part of our character. We change culture this way. But here's the beautiful thing about a pursuit like this. And Proverbs, an Old Testament wisdom book, I believe says it best. It says this: a generous person will prosper. Whoever refreshes others will be refreshed. That's the paradox about generosity. When we live our lives focused on being generous, we actually experience the life Jesus talked about and the life each and every single one of us truly want. The life that so many of us are striving for through our pursuits of more. It's the upside down approach that Jesus was famous for laying out. I mean, he did say, for whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. Friends, if you want to experience something deeper, greater, bigger than just the next limited high of something new for your life, be generous. Live generously. Embrace the posture of generosity. And remember, a generous person prospers, and whoever refreshes others will themselves be refreshed. And so the question, the challenge that I'm leaving you with this week is simply this: what is one act of generosity that will stretch you this week? I'm going to ask you to stand if you can, please. I'm going to close in prayer. Jesus, I thank you for your word. I thank you that it really challenges the deepest parts of our character, of our actions, of our being. And I pray for all of us here that we may be marked as givers and not takers. I pray that we may be men and women who exemplify Jesus to the world around us and your heart to the world around us through the actions of generosity. So help us to be aligned more in that camp. Help us to just make our actions, our thoughts, our words, and our deeds in line with you in this way. And so, for those of us who are feeling challenged, stretch us in that way, God. Help us to move towards that, and may we be givers and live in the posture of generosity. And I want to pray for, maybe you're here today and you don't know Jesus personally, but you sense that you want to make a commitment to follow him. You're saying, I want to give him my heart. I want to give him my life. I want to surrender all that I am to him. Jesus gave the greatest gift of all. He was the biggest giver of all. He sacrificed his life for our own life so that we can have life. And if you're here this morning, you're saying, I want to make that commitment. We believe you can do it just simply through a prayer offered in faith. And I'm going to ask you to pray along with me. Jesus says, I'm here today. I just want to surrender myself to you. I thank you for the cross. I thank you that you died, that you rose again, that you gave your life for my life. And so I give all that I am to you. I ask that you come into my heart and mind. I want to pattern my life after yours from this day forward. I want to live as someone who looks like Jesus, and just help me to do that. And so, Lord, I pray for every individual, for every couple, and for every family represented here this morning. I pray strength, wisdom, guidance, and blessing upon them as they go into this week. I pray that they may be generous and experience the refreshing of you in their lives as a result of their generosity. And so, God, use them, guide them, direct them, and steer them to do one thing that will stretch them in this avenue to experience just your refreshing in their life. And I pray this in your name, Jesus. Amen.